Hello everybody and welcome to our special tour of the National Army Museum's exhibition Photo Friend, the British Army in Germany since 1945. We estimate more than 1 million people served with the British Army, lived with the British Army in Germany from 1945 to 2019, and today we're going to look at a theme around what life in Germany was actually like for those people, whether it was serving or whether it was living life in the garrisons. We're going to show you some objects that hopefully spark some nostalgia for some of you who actually experienced it for yourselves, or at least give you an insight into what this was like for those of you who are coming to this fresh. There's some wonderful stories, some wonderful objects in this gallery, and we're going to show them to you now. Very soon after the end of the Second World War in 1945, the British Army began occupying their zone of Germany. And pretty quickly it became a place where there was going to be a really heavy concentration of British Army troops. National service was taking place in this period as well, and so for many people Germany was going to be their destination where they actually carried out their 2 years in uniform. When it came to their area of the occupation, the old joke around between the Allies was that the French got the wine, the Americans got the scenery, and the British got the ruins and the rubble. And actually that period and area of northwest Germany, what Britain was so heavily rebuilding, was a major effort for them. However, when it came to recruitment and advertising the possibility of travelling overseas, Germany still played its role in trying to attract new recruits, volunteers to the British Army outside of those conscripts. And yet some of these were slightly more fanciful, perhaps more imagined than what actually people had access to. At the same time, Germany did offer a sense of adventure. It was a foreign country, it was a place to serve overseas that was perhaps a lot more safer than going to serve in Korea, for example, or Malaya. And so it was an attractive posting. So for the soldiers who were serving in Germany in this period and the families who had been brought over to live with them, there was a mixture of duty and then off-duty life. The duties typically in this early period after the Second World War were around guarding, perhaps administering, delivering aid, rebuilding Germany, most famously the British efforts to rebuild the Volkswagen factory, for example. But there was also a thriving cultural scene as well, in which theatre flourished, horticultural societies were established, but then obviously it being the British Army, sport was a major part of that too. And this extended to both the soldiers but also their families and became a major part of the fabric of life for the garrisons, which remained in this period very separate from their German neighbours. The British even had their own currency to use throughout this period as well. The black market was so rampant throughout the early years in Germany of the British occupation. The British tried to stabilise that, tried to bring a bit of order and economic sense and stability to their zone by establishing and using their own currency. So British Armed Forces vouchers, better known as BAFs, were given to the soldiers, and it was the only currency in which they could use. Now, the black marketeer and the profiteers managed to break into this as well, so actually they had to be reissued several times. And in many ways, it's a question of cat and mouse between trying to catch the black marketeers, but also have a working currency as well. Sport was a major aspect of life for the British Army of the Rhine, and this was also a major aspect for the families and members attached to it, one of whom was a woman called Beverly Shergold. Now, Bevis was a remarkable woman. She'd served in the Second World War herself in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and she'd actually worked in military intelligence. But she moved to Germany with her husband after the war. He had a role in the Control Commission. And actually what Bevis brought uniquely to the British Army of the Rhine was her own sporting ability. And in fact, she was an Olympic grade athlete. She would have gone to the Olympics had they not been cancelled by the Second World War. She did actually get to fulfil her Olympic dream in 1948, but in the meantime she had to sort of satisfy herself with competing in the inter-army competitions that would be run, most notably in badminton, where she pretty much swept the board in multiple years, taking on all comers and defeating them. And she was a champion of that and really a wonderful lady and a wonderful personality of those early years of the British Army of the Rhine. The city of Berlin was located deep inside the Soviet zone of East Germany, and yet the British maintained a presence there. They had 3,000 soldiers in the Berlin garrison, they had their associated families, there were teachers for the children of those families as well as a host of other civil servants too. Yet getting to Berlin itself required a lot of coordination. It required filling out documents such as these to get the permission of the Russians and the French and the Americans. Everything had to be done in triplicate. All movement was heavily controlled, be it by road, be it by air, or famously on Berliner, the train that used to carry people up and down the rail corridor. The train itself ran every day apart from Christmas Day and a short period during the Berlin blockade as well, between 1945 and 1991, and was one of these wonderful rituals, one of these unique aspects of British military life in Germany that people got to enjoy. Yet all of these rituals, while seemingly tedious, while seemingly quite mundane, actually masked an important reality. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, deep inside enemy territory. For the soldiers and their families who were living there, it had extra excitement, undoubtedly, of prison about being there, especially so close to the wall and so close to the enemy. And yet it was undoubtedly a site of great tension as well, something that had real flashpoints throughout the British period and British time there. Berlin had wonderful facilities, it was a wonderful way of life, and yet you couldn't escape that growing sense of threat about what might happen, what could happen if the Soviets chose to attack.
All the officers and their wives were encouraged to go through, and we used to go through in a coach, and we'd go to the opera. And all the girls wore their best ball gowns, and all the husbands wore all their mess kit, and all we had to do was hold our closed passport up against the window as we drove through. We used to go out for dinner. It was the most fabulous German restaurant, and they used to have Chateaubriand and gull's eggs, and they had a three-piece band, and as we walked in, they'd play God Save the Queen.
Another unique aspect of service life in Berlin, and a real perk actually of service life in Berlin, was being able to make use of the Family Rations Issue Service, or FRIS. Now, this system had been designed to essentially keep the garrison and the families supplied in the event of another Berlin blockade. And yet it gave the British access to high quality products at pretty reasonable prices as well. Probably much better than was actually available back in the British zone of West Germany too. And actually, if you look at this map, what you can see is not only the routes that these FRIS delivery took, but you can actually see the physical footprint the British were already laying down in Berlin as part of their occupation. And in fact, even just some of the names of the roads that were built, the quarters that were established where the British lived, some of them are still there now. But you know, Kiplingweg, Hardyweg, Miltonweg, these are named after British poets in the heart of Berlin, which obviously for so long had been enemy territory, and yet now was being established in this new era of friendship. In the British zone of West Germany, everybody was enlisted in operating a system of vigilance and security for citing Soxmis, the Soviet mission, whose job it was to basically go around and gather intelligence on the British capabilities. Everybody was issued with one of these cards, nicknamed a Soxmis card, but it was actually BFG Form 66. And with that, it detailed how to spot a Soxmis vehicle, but more importantly, what to do if you saw one. You were supposed to ring the Royal Military Police in Hereford, tell them exactly where you saw them, what direction they were going in, etc. And then they would actually quite nicely send you a little thank you card as well. But all of these were carried at all times by British servicemen, by their families as well. And they were a really important part of life there. And whilst life would carry on as normal for many people, it sort of underlined that constant level of threat and that constant reasoning for why the British were in Germany. For the British, preparedness was key throughout the Cold War, and life in Germany was built around training but also maintaining the vehicles. And within those vehicles was one particular piece of kit that made the British stand out from their international allies, but was also vital to winning the Cold War, and that was the boiling vessel, or the BV. Within this, housed in any armoured vehicle, the British soldiers, the tank crews, the vehicle crews could make tea, they could heat their food, and it was absolutely essential in maintaining morale throughout long training exercises, particularly in the cold German winters. If the BV didn't work, the vehicle didn't leave the barracks. It was that simple. And for many people, this was the weapon that won the Cold War. There were a few mishaps in time. If you didn't fix the lid on properly, you would end up with curried turret if the tins exploded in there as well. And yet it was essential and was something the British soldiers always looked back on. And more importantly, it was something that American soldiers often looked at with great envy because they didn't have anything like that in their own vehicle. British soldiers spent millions of hours on the specialist training areas available to them in West Germany during the Cold War, honing their skills. These all had particular reputations and legends attached to them. The stairs at Vogelsang, the haunted buildings at Sennelager, but perhaps none of them had as great a legend as Wolfgang Meyer of the Soltau-Lüneburg training area. Wolfgang was an absolute icon of the Cold War, a legend in his own time, an enterprising German who would travel the training areas in his blue van, selling refreshments to British soldiers on exercise. He was loved by all who found him, and yet at the same time he had his own particular stories attached to him. Everyone was always happy when he turned up, and yet no one could quite figure out exactly how he knew where they were in their supposedly classified hidden positions. This is just one of those really rich, unique stories of life that came from the British Army of the Rhine, and one that unfortunately now has passed into history.
We were far more worried in Germany about the IRA threat. I mean, if you think about, those things you have to do on risk assessments, likelihood and seriousness. Nuclear war is highly unlikely but very serious. An IRA bomb is less serious but much more likely. So whilst we were in BAR, we didn't get into our cars without looking underneath them with a mirror.
Despite the Cold War and the looming threat of the Soviet Union across the inner German border, another threat began increasingly intruding on British life in West Germany. As British soldiers began deploying out of Germany to Northern Ireland to undertake 4-month tours as part of Operation Banner and help with the troubles there, the IRA itself began targeting the British in Germany from the 1970s onwards. Rhine was bombed, Osnabrück was attacked, soldiers were murdered on the street. It was a real and dangerous threat, and built in the British a sense of vigilance, a culture of vigilance that was established. All the British, for example, were issued with handheld mirrors to sweep under their cars for any devices that might have been left. Information was given about how to protect people from what the terrorist threat represented to them. More and more you heard accounts of near misses or, sadly, more and more successful attacks from the IRA on British service personnel. The British took extra efforts as well. They removed number plates from all their vehicles, the distinctive military number plates that would identify them, and replace them with others, all trying to reduce their visibility to the terrorists. And yet this was something that became increasingly real. Whilst it was undoubtedly a smaller threat than what the Soviet Union and potential nuclear war represented, it was somehow more real and actually more likely that they would be targeted by it, and the British responded in kind. One of the major services helping the British in their time throughout Germany was provided by the NAFI. Now, the NAFI always goes where the British Army goes, where British forces go overseas as well. And in Germany, it ran pubs, it ran clubs, restaurants, but also supermarkets. And in the early years, the British occupation in particular, and the British deployment, it provided a really important taste of home. You know, through the NAFI, the British could get some of those products they were most familiar with, that they buy in the supermarkets in Britain. Also, the NAFI even sold cars. It really sold everything to the British community and was a one-stop shop. Now, as British confidence grew throughout their time in Germany, as they began to venture off camp a lot more, shop in German supermarkets a lot more, that central place the NAFI held began to diminish slightly. But it's always been there. In fact, it still is there in Germany now, providing a really important sense of home for the British. Family was actually a really important aspect of life of British Army of the Rhine and British Army in Germany throughout this period. You know, it was quite unique for the soldiers to be able to live in such close proximity to where they worked and where they trained, but also have their families with them at the same time too. And the army put a huge amount of effort into supporting those families as well. You know, there were family guides that were produced for the garrison towns, detailing what facilities were available. The garrisons themselves organised lots of events too. Things like the Rhine Army Summer Show had a big family appeal. It was about the soldiers coming together as well, but also huge amounts of activity for the children in particular. And then of course there were the schools, and there were schools right across the British zone, many of which had been established in the very early years, but some of which were moved and relocated. And these were real touch points for generations of people to pass through. You know, many soldiers who served in Germany in some of the later years had been children themselves in British Forces Germany too. And so, you know, whether it was Hayes School, King Alfred School, Prince Rupert School, you know, some of those first ones had really been established. You know, that education aspect really made sure that the British presence in Germany had the aspect of any other small town. You know, it had its clubs, its social activities, but also its schools and its shops as well. Yet, at the same time as this was taking place, the British Army began to be deployed more overseas. So whereas family life before had been built around soldiers going off on training, perhaps going into the field for large exercises for several weeks at a time, now they were deploying overseas for months at a time, to the Balkans, to Iraq, to Afghanistan. And those created new pressures on family life for those people living in Germany. Since 2010, the British Army has been steadily reducing the number of forces it has in Germany, and now there's only really a fraction left. So for many, those icons of their service, those particular instances and examples and objects and stories that had with them began to pass into memory. For the Germans, this had a real economic impact as well. You know, in 2013, it was estimated as much that 1.3 billion euros was put into the German economy by the British Army. And you know, there were several businesses that thrived on British Army custom. You know, Hereford, the famous yellow handbag that accompanied British on exercise for decades. When the British left, they lost about 50% of their revenue when the British Army left Hereford. So you can see that there was enormous social and cultural links that had been established and began to ebb away. And yet the legacy and the memories of the British Army in Germany won't be forgotten so easily, and I think they'll carry on well into the future. One of the big rituals that followed the drawdown and the British leaving Germany were a series of parades, big acts of friendship between the garrisons and the local German communities. Behind me here, you can see the pipes and drums of British Forces Germany parading through Paderborn when 20th Army Brigade was presented with a Fahnenband by the local people there. And these acts of friendship, these stories, are something that will carry on in future. You know, the British will stay in Germany, they will continue to train there, but they won't ever be there in as many numbers as they were before. You know, that period, that chapter of history has now come to a close. For us, it's been wonderful that we can mark that and we can show it in this exhibition. It's such an important part, not only of the British Army's history, but of Britain's history too. The British Army and Germany touched so many lives in so many different ways. It's been great that we can share this with you now, and we really hope that you might be able to see you soon in the museum.
Hello, everybody, and I hope that you enjoyed watching the final instalment in the series of our virtual guided tours of the special exhibition Photo Friend. Today's video looked at what it was like to live and serve in the British Army in Germany. More than 1 million British soldiers and their families have served in Germany over the last 75 years. The everyday experiences of these people, whether at work, rest or play, is at the heart of our exhibition, Photo Friend, British Army in Germany since 1945. In this tour, we saw some of the key objects that illustrate this story, from the Soxmis card to school uniforms, the Boylan vessel to yellow handbags. And for those of you that served in Germany, we hope that what you just watched was a nice trip down memory lane. And for those of you wanting to learn more, it's provided you with a fascinating insight into the daily lives of serving soldiers of the British Army of the Rhine. Of course, I'm joined today by none other than Dr. Peter Johnston, the lead curator of this exhibition and the head of research here at the National Army Museum. Today's tour has gone out across multiple channels and we have collated all of your questions and we will try and get through as many of them. So do keep posting your questions, whether you're on Facebook, YouTube or Crowdcast. Send your questions through and we'll get them to Peter. So Peter, to kick us off, why was Germany such a great place for families to be based, and why did it become a family posting?
I mean, I think, and so to answer the second part of that first, in 1946, Germany is declared a home posting, and the War Office, as is declares, establishes what they call Operation Union, which means that soldiers serving in the occupation army can apply to have their families come out and join them. And the reason they did this is the army sort of recognized that they were going to be in Germany for a long time. You know, Montgomery was talking about being in Germany for 50 years. You know, it ended up being far longer, but that sort of outlasted Monty's expectations anyway. And the British realized, you know, serving in this area, serving in this place and needing to be there was proven quite a strain. And particularly for soldiers, you know, some of whom had joined up during the wartime, were waiting to be demobilized, and then were coming through. And there was this new generation of soldiers coming through, national servicemen. The army sort of realized that if they thought that, well, if people can serve with their families, then, you know, they can retain the experienced, you know, leaders, NCOs, officers, etc. And then bring, particularly as national service came into effect, bring through this new generation of national servicemen too, without overly weakening the army. And it meant that the British could lay down sort of a firm establishment and be in Germany. And if they were going to be posted there, if they were going to be there for a long time, obviously it meant that they need to be concerned less about home leave and all these sorts of things too. So there were a lot of military reasons, practical reasons, and this sort of thing that meant people could serve there with their families. And they did, and they applied in huge numbers, and people started coming out really early on, you know, virtually from the get-go. And I think one of the reasons why it was so good is obviously it varied depending on where you were in Germany, depending on what local resources you had, and depending when you were there. You know, if you were there, for people who were there in the 40s and into the early 50s, for example, Germany was still very much recovering, and was a very different place. But, you know, for people that were there in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it remained fantastic because there were great facilities. There was a really good balance between working and home life for soldiers during the Cold War. That changed a little bit after the wall came down and the army reorientated itself. And, you know, the quality of life was really good. The housing was much better than it is in the UK, which was important. The sports facilities were all there. And there was this big community. Now, that's not to say some people didn't struggle. You know, they were in a foreign country. It could be quite isolating for people that some of whom had never even left the UK before to sort of up sticks and move to Germany. But on the whole, people seemed to really enjoy it. There were added benefits as well. There was, you know, something called Kindergeld, which is, you know, essentially child benefit that soldiers were paid as well for living in Germany with the army, as well as all the tax-free benefits they got in terms of fuel, so they could go off and travel and explore and these sorts of things as well. So all of these things combined together made Germany just a really interesting place. It was different. It was sort of a bit like the UK, but at the same time different enough to be exciting, worth exploring. And the British were always in a great place to do that, because they had a position of, you know, investment, of power, of authority that meant they could go off and do these sorts of things. And many of them took the opportunity to do that.
I suppose linked to that, we talk so much about the families, but what was it like to, you know, have a single life in Germany?
Yeah, so I mean, for a lot of people, it was great being a single soldier in Germany. You know, the barrack accommodation was for the most part better than what was available in the UK. You know, if you read the accounts of some of the national servicemen, they come out of, you know, absolutely horrendous barrack accommodation where they'd done their basic training in the UK. You get posted to Germany, and they turn up in the old Kasernas, what are called the Hitler blocks, because they were built by the Wehrmacht in the 30s, and you know, they've all got double glazing, central heating. There's 2 and 4 man rooms rather than 8 man rooms. There's more privacy, there's more space, and you know, all of this thing worked really well. And then of course what they've got is they've got the LOA, the living overseas allowance. They've got more money in their pocket. They've got a very favorable exchange rate in Germany in comparison to what they'd have in the UK as well. So their pay goes a lot further, and they've got an ability to, you know, to go downtown, to meet new people, to fraternize with the Fraulines, increasingly from the 50s onwards. And this is stuff that people really love. And you know, if you're a young single soldier, you know, why have you joined the army? Lots of people have joined the army to get away from wherever it is that they're from, in some cases, and travel and explore. And so service in Germany allowed people to do that, whilst also being, you know, quite structured and regimented around its professional activities. There was still a lot of time for the social side of things. And you know, the investment in sport that the army did in Germany was massive, absolutely massive. And yes, it's all bound up in this sense of, you know, enhancing the fighting power and the active component. But you know, in the UK, you couldn't just go skiing for weeks on end, which is what you do in Germany. You know, the regiments maintained their own ski huts. They had huge parties.
I love hearing some of those stories when, you know, about the sport and what a vital part it was for their life in Germany. And I think especially when we were putting these tours together, being able to pull some of those oral histories out and to listen to some of their experiences. And the lady in the video that we've just watched, you know, talks about going to the opera and those experiences, which, you know, they might not have been able to have experienced some of those things back in the UK as much lavish as they were in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly it. I mean, you know, if you're stationed in Catterick or in Tidworth, or in Lisbon or something in Northern Ireland, you know, you're not going to get to go to the opera. Whereas if you're in Berlin, it's just the done thing. It's just what people do. And so, you know, it converts people. People might not be particular fans of the opera, but you'll go and do it. You get to cross into East Germany, which in itself is very interesting. And you get to go into, you know, because obviously the East Germans and the Soviets in particular invested huge amounts in culture. And it's one of the things they sort of drive upwards. And so it became a real cultural hub. And so you can go and do that, and it's brilliant. But the other thing that people talked about so much and always talked about was something called Snow Queen. Snow Queen.
Someone's just mentioned that in a question on YouTube, saying there was a wealth of sporting opportunities as well as adventure training, including Snow Queen, downhill skiing paid for by the army.
Yeah, well, in not always particularly well supervised downhill skiing, it has to be said as well. But you know, downhill skiing was this major thing, and it was this part of this annual cycle. And you know, there was sort of this ritual dance of deterrence that the army was engaged in throughout the Cold War, in particular, where you know they do small unit level training and then build up to the big autumn exercises. But then part of that also was in the winter they go off and do Snow Queen. And they go off and ski and just have a really good time. And the army was essentially paying to teach people to ski. And, you know, The army still maintains that now. The army still goes out and people can still go skiing and snowboarding with the army. But, it wasn't as absolutely ingrained as it was back then. And, without, budget airlines or anything like this, the ability to basically, within a few hours drive, get down to Bavaria in the German Alps was phenomenal. And people absolutely relished taking that opportunity. And it was really important. And then they could take their families too, as well. You could go in the Harz Mountains as well, which are actually a bit closer than Bavaria. And so all of this stuff was just there on the doorstep, ready to be explored. And, I think when you talk to people about, whether they enjoy Germany, the sort of the common trend is the people that push their own horizons and open their own boundaries, got off camp, went places, even if they just went downtown for a few drinks every now and then, those were the people who enjoyed it the most. The people who stayed on camp in particular and didn't get outside the wire, those were the ones who tended to struggle. And, there were reasons for that. The language was a barrier, don't get me wrong, for sure. But for people who could put themselves in that situation, they always seem to have enjoyed it far more.
I think, we've spoken so much about that exciting part of Germany and the posting, but I suppose one of the things that we touch on in this film in particular is about the threat of the IRA. So I suppose, how much were people aware of it, and how much did people talk about it?
Yeah, that was actually something that was really interesting to me as I was doing all the research for the exhibition and for the book, because I was built this up and I was like, okay, it's the army in Germany. What's the army in Germany doing? Well, it's staring down the Russians across the German border. But then increasingly, as I spoke to more people, because this exhibition is essentially a celebration of people's time in Germany, and it uses all of their own words and voices. It became so apparent that the IRA had this major part in this cultural memory of it. And we've talked about this a little bit in some of the other tours, but, the issue of things like the folding mirrors to go under the cars, that had nothing to do with the Soviets and everything to do with the threat of the IRA. And when I read into it, a lot more, I began to, you read about the bombings at Rhine, the mortaring at Osnabrück, the other bomb attempts at Bielefeld, some of the murders that tragically took place as well. For soldiers either transitioning back to the UK, moving back to the UK, or just leaving their house in the morning in Germany. The attempts to attack soldiers on their routes, put bombs inside bikes that are chained up outside the barracks, attach stuff underneath cars, and this was a very, very real threat. And it affected, it didn't just affect the soldiers; it affected their families as well. And there's so many fascinating knock-on effects. The changing the registration on plates on the cars to take off the really distinctive British ones, or put on British, or put on number plates of sort of imaginary dealerships and all this sort of stuff as well, because obviously you can't disguise whether it's a left or right-handed car. All these under car mirrors, the bonnet check, everything like this was really important. It became part of people's lives, and it's amazing, really. We talk about things now, living in this heightened sense of security, particularly in London and other sort of central, big cities, and the risk of international terrorism and stuff like that. And yet, for people of my generation in particular, the troubles is far more remote. And so having listened to people talk about it, and the way in which Northern Ireland, obviously because the soldiers in Germany deployed to Northern Ireland on active duty as well, but the way that the trouble of Northern Ireland followed them into Germany, or even actively sought them out in Germany, was really interesting to read about, and hear about people's responses to it and their reactions to it as well.
Completely. We've got lots of comments coming on through the chat, with people just saying that we're taking them back to their childhood. And another retired lieutenant colonel says that he served for 3 times in the British Army of the Rhine, and was also there during the major threat of the IRA offensive in 88-89. He says that life and opportunities were fantastic for both family and the single soldier, but not to get the RAF that were also involved.
Obviously, the RAF are there, and we talk about them in the exhibition. We actually, we talk about them in the previous tours with things like the airlift and stuff. But with a subject as big as this, we had to. We're the Army Museum, so we sort of draw a line with the sand in that. Yeah, but the RAF are part of this too, for sure.
We've got a great question coming in from Katie, who says, I was a small child in Dortmund in the mid-60s, and my memories are a bit sketchy. What has become of the barracks and the officers' quarters there?
So, what's happened to the barracks and the complexes has depended really on when some of them were given back. Dortmund is quite heavily affected by options for change in the mid 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and a lot of those units are sent back to the UK. A lot of that is closed down. Dortmund was a real centre of where the Royal Artillery was. It was nicknamed the Gunner Ghetto for a while. All of these towns have these wonderful nicknames. So Detmold is wet mold, Whirl is curly whirly, all this sort of stuff. And then there's an ongoing joke about Bielefeld because it doesn't exist, Bielefeld not actually being a real place because, of all this sorts of thing. But in terms of the barracks, they've had a real variety of sort of knock-on effects and afterlife. So a lot of them has been knocked down and built over. In Osnabrück, some of them have been taken over by the university. And sort of turned into campus buildings for that. In Celle, the big barracks in the centre of Celle has become the new Rathaus, so their new town hall. It's a big, massive brick building there, and a Bundeswehr unit has moved in to the barracks on the top of the hill in Celle. In some cases, the Bundeswehr has moved in, but in lots of cases, the barracks have even fallen into disrepair and are empty, or have been converted to other use. So Fallenbostel, for example, has been used to house refugees most recently. And actually, they were talking about when the coronavirus pandemic hit and they were going to have to bring German nationals back to Germany, much in the same way that most countries did. They were talking about, sort of using these barracks essentially as temporary accommodation to manage people through quarantine, because, they've got power, they're well built, they're heated, it's easy to maintain people because they've got fences around them, all this sort of stuff, but that never really worked out. So a lot of them stay empty. The old 1BR Corps headquarters in Bielefeld is now a school, and the guardroom is a bike shed, which is quite funny. People go down to spend time behind the bike shed, but they probably wouldn't avoid the guardroom at all costs when it was in its previous life. But then there's others, Allenbrook Barracks in Paderborn, which the Rifles were in until they marched out. They were the last people who were based there. 5 Rifles, and that is actually that predates any of the Hitler blocks, and so that was built in the early 20th century, and it's a beautiful building, and so it's almost like a listed building, so it can't be knocked down. And actually, I saw plans to turn that into essentially a village, housing, knock through some of the rooms into apartments and flats. Use the sports field for as sports facilities for local people, parks, all of this opening up. I think the pandemic has probably affected plans for that, but that was certainly what the intention was. Yeah, so varied. Ultimately, some of the barracks are still there. Some still stand. Some of them you can have been repurposed, and sadly, some of them have been erased from the physical landscape.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a bit more, and I know that this will probably spark a few more comments and questions in the chat, but we talk a lot about Wolfgang, and I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about him.
Yeah, so I mean, Wolfgang is part of sort of this cultural memory of Germany, and he's a very particular part of it. So it depended entirely on what branch you served in. I'm not sure the light infantry or anything like that had such a connection to Wolfgang. But if you were armored infantry and you spent any time up in Soltau, the Soltau-Lüneburg training area, then you would have come across Wolfgang, or someone would have told you about Wolfgang or something like that basically between the 1970s and when it was handed back in the 1990s to the German federal government. And what Wolfgang did is, he was a very enterprised individual. From his van, he sold hot food, he sold beer, and he just turn up in the middle of these train exercises. He'd take his business to where there were customers, and he just happened to do it in the middle of training exercises where there's armored vehicles roaming around. And it was hilarious because people were supposed to be like hunkered down, they're supposed to be leaguered up, disguised, camouflaged, all this sort of stuff, and he just turned up because he knew where they were. And there are all these stories. There was this idea that he was maybe he was a Soviet spy, and that's how he knew where everyone was. But I remember he always said that the way he found out is he just basically found someone who was likely to know, gave them a case of beer to get them to tell him, and then they'd show them on their maps where most people were likely to be, and he'd just drive off and try and find them. But he had his little music that he played through. He was a big fan of Elvis. He used to play the music through there to sort of let people know he was coming. He got stuck so many times and got pulled out. He was just part of it. He was just part of life there. And he is still alive. He's not been particularly well, but he is still alive. And we in fact sent him a poster of the exhibition for his wall, which he has received, which I'm really pleased about.
Oh, brilliant! Did you get any feedback on what he thought of the poster?
Not as of yet, because he currently lives in supported accommodation, and obviously because of the coronavirus pandemic in Germany in particular, they've been in a pretty heavy lockdown. So no word has come out, but I do know he's received it. So we're hoping something will come out of that again soon.
It's quite amazing it's quite amazing when you see some of these military Facebook groups, and you just mentioned the word Wolfgang and it just gets everyone going, and it's just so amazing, as you say, that how it's so instilled in that cultural legacy of the British Army being based in Germany. Can you tell us about the van?
This was what I was going to say. Like my one regret, about that exhibition, and I love that exhibition, is I couldn't get the original van, and I did try, but it is long gone to the scrap dealer, unfortunately. Wolfgang sold up in the late 90s, basically after the army left Soltau and the train area there, and it went back to the federal government. And he used all the money, opened a campsite, had a very comfortable life afterwards. But yeah, that van has long gone, unfortunately. But we had to put it in. We had to recreate it, even just as a snapshot, because it's not the only feature of life in Germany. People will talk about all the different training areas they went on. Senna Lager as being probably the worst lager in the world, for example. And there was Senna Burger in Senna Lager. So there was a similar thing too. Vogelsang, and some of the areas around Vogelsang features quite heavily in this too. But Wolfgang really was like the central component of it. And as so much of the Cold War effort in particular was built around armor, as so much of the armored stuff went on up in Soltau, it was so important to put him in, and to touch base, and to it's just one of these unique things about the British Army in Germany that really just won't happen anywhere else, I don't think.
Completely. And another
unless
thing,
there's a guy in Estonia doing it right now, at which point I'm all ears to hear, but learn more about that. So
let us know if you're watching. One of the things we also touch on in the film is NAAFI. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the importance and how integral that was to the British Army and the soldiers and, their families whilst they were based out there, giving them that community and the sense of life back home.
Yeah, I think if anything, the NAAFI was probably more important for the family and the community there too. Initially what the NAAFI did is they ran the canteens, they ran the restaurants, the cafes, and it was more than just like a supermarket or anything like that. But then they've sort of gradually moved into it. And then, come back to what you asked first about why the families go out there, because the families are coming out, suddenly the NAAFI begin to open what they call family shops to stock things specifically for them, things like nappies and stuff like that for babies, stuff that, normally you wouldn't supply to an army because you don't need it. But this so what was amazing about NAAFI is that they changed as well. And the army being based in Germany and the way they were based in Germany made them change. But they've always continued to be there, and they expanded, and they had their enormous distribution center at Krefeld. They had some of the first computer systems to monitor price changes, because obviously they had to keep track of things like the exchange rate and update all their prices accordingly on top of that. And they had a vast operation. They were sourcing wines, they were sourcing bacon. At one point they even, and this has always struck me as quite obscure. At one point, when there's during the foot and mouth crisis in the 70s, the German government banned the import of British meat into Germany. And so rather than rely on German sausages, people can draw their own conclusions about which is better, but rather than rely on German sausages, the NAAFI sends someone to a German sausage factory to tell them how to make sausages the way the British people like them, which is amazing. And all this stuff was very much part and parcel. You could buy a car through NAAFI. You could buy musical instruments were really popular through NAAFI. It was everything. The big store at Rhine used to draw people from hours away who drive to the massive store at Rhine that was opened, and shop there. And as people grew a little bit more in confidence, particularly through the 80s and into the 90s and the present day now, people do a lot of their shopping off camp anyway. They don't always use the NAAFI. It's a good place to get sort of British essentials, but nowadays the community are very happy and comfortable going into places like Aldi and stuff like that in German supermarkets, and getting their stuff there. But for a time that for a long time, you know, particularly before, when people can only bring home like once a week and stuff like that, you know, the NAFI, BFBS, these things were absolutely people's connection with home. Because, you know, while home was Germany, people still understood that, you know, people obviously still felt very British. And the garrisons and the camps, yes, they were in Germany, but they were still islands of British culture in this German sea. And so these were really crucial touch points for people. And it made the transition for some people easier. You know, I think one of the things I wish I talked about a little bit more in the exhibition actually is some of the challenges that spouses could face in particular. Because, you know, if you're a soldier, you know, your life is quite heavily governed and regimented by what you do. You know, you have your job and you go and do that. But if you're a spouse, then sometimes there could be quite long periods of inactivity, boredom, isolation that made it quite difficult and challenging for some people. And, you know, that's something I think that needs to be addressed. And there were some fantastic places that did it. You know, some of the grassroots garrison, you know, stuff that had no official sort of structures to it. It was just driven by people that wanted to make a difference. In places like Fanenbostel or Hona or something like that were brilliant. And actually that ends up being some of what people look back on most favorably, was that sense of community that existed there, because you didn't have all the other distractions. You know, people weren't living all over the country and just commuting in or anything like that. People lived essentially there together and identified as such.
And we've got lots of comments coming through saying, someone said, the best shopping experience was going to the American PX in the southern area of Germany. And then another person said about remember the Globe Cinema in camp, and don't forget the clubs, the bars, and the NAFI bop.
Yeah, exactly. See, all these things, and I mean, the Globe Cinema, for example, every camp had a cinema. It was called the Globe in every single one. And it was run by the Army Kino Corporation, which is always amazing because they chose the German word for cinema, which is, you know, quite funny. But then you know, the NAFI was the center of shopping. It was the center of entertainment. It was absolutely crucial. And the NAFI, I think, is celebrating its centenary this year. So, you know, happy 100 years to them. Long may they continue. They're still there. They're still in Germany. They're still everywhere else. They're still everywhere else the Army is. You know, I've been in the NAFI in the Falklands. So, you know, wherever the forces go, the NAFI goes. And, you know, Germany was a really important part of that. And actually, just on the last point on this, you know, when the British deployed overseas, you know, when they started actually deploying out of Germany for Granby, which we've just done the 30-year anniversary of Granby, for the Balkans, and there, people from the NAFI go with them. You know, people from the NAFI actually go with them and help supply them whilst they're deployed in theatre too. So that shouldn't be overlooked either. Completely.
That was actually going to be my next question about how did life change on base when troops did start to be deployed to the Middle East, Falklands and other places?
So, I mean, the fall, the sort of the opening up of the wall, the reunification of Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union has a massive impact on the army in Germany, because obviously, you know, in a really short period of time, so you go from staring down the superpower on the verge, you know, on the prospect of nuclear war, to questions being asked about what the army's for. Like, why is it here? Is this the right kit? What job's it going to do? Do we need to have this many people in it? And, you know, all of these are questions that we're having right now. All of this stuff is cyclical for the army. It comes around again. But, you know, that period in 1990, 1991 was a major moment of that, for sure. And I wouldn't say it was an existential crisis for the army, but it sort of it completely forced a reorganization, a reorientation. And the government suddenly realized that actually in Germany what you had is this highly effective, well-trained force that could now be deployed anywhere, you know, from the heart of Europe, on the rail network, all this sort of stuff. And that's why, you know, it begins to be deployed to places like the Balkans. It goes off to, you know, it is German. It's the British Army in Germany that empties to fight Saddam the first time on Granby. It's them again who go off to fight in 2003. It's a brigade in Germany that closes both Telik combat operations and Herrick combat operations in Afghanistan in 2014 too. And so, you know, Germany becomes the launch pad. Now, that makes the army incredibly busy. You know, the soldiers, suddenly they have a completely brand new routine where they're doing pre-deployment training, they're doing workup training for prospective missions, and then they've got post-operational leave. And in a way that pre-1990, they just didn't have. They didn't have that same sort of calendar because they all always had to be maintained in Germany. So it transforms what soldiering was, definitely, and how busy it was for them. But also has massive impacts on the family too, because, you know, when you think about the previous 45 years, you know, the soldier has worked essentially where he's lived. And after that, suddenly the soldier's been deployed elsewhere to do his job and use Germany as a training base and so it creates long periods of absence from between soldiers and their families. And that has a knock-on effect on soldiers' families and it can make it quite difficult, which is where some of these grassroots structures about, you know, maintaining and supporting the fighting power by supporting the family become so important. And, you know, it's actually quite interesting, you know, the true impact of this, I could talk about this for ages, but actually, if you want to learn more about the impact of this, come back next week on Wednesday, because Andy Richards has just written a book about this. And he and I having a chat about the impact that, you know, the army faced and in the decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall coming down, and how that impacted the army. You know, he actually lived that experience too. So come back and join us then for that, for sure.
Yeah, we'll share a link in the chat for some of you to be able to come back and watch that event next Wednesday. I suppose a way to round up this is how did people, particularly their families, spouses, children, have trouble rehabilitating into Britain when they did start to be posted back?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I think it's still one of sort of the unanswered questions about what's happened. Obviously, there's still a community in Germany, and hello to anybody who's in Germany watching this, who's still there. You know, the British Army Germany is still a thing. There are still families there. Attenborough School is still going. You know, so the legacy continues there. It's just a new chapter of this relationship. But for the units that came back and the people, you know, that it's been quite challenging for some. You know, some people chose to leave the army rather than leave Germany. Some people's relationships didn't survive the prospect of them being posted back to the UK. You know, if they had a German spouse, for example, I know of several cases where that happened. So, you know, it's not been easy by any stretch of the imagination. There was a lot of, you know, you saw at the time, there were a lot of people who were really apprehensive about coming back because obviously the employment model, the accommodation model in the UK is different. People don't live necessarily in the same concentrations. They don't go to military schools. Their kids will go to just general schools. And if you're not surrounded by people that have that same context, that same experience and lived experience of you and understand it, it can be quite difficult, you know, making that move back for others too. So I think really what might be a fascinating study to do is to, you know, maybe in 5 years' time, is to actually look back on this and say, well, actually, how has this impacted? You know, how many people did leave the army out of these units? What happened to them? How many people said, you know, that they wanted to sort of, you know, to either go back to Germany or stay in Germany? Once we've got a bit more of a more complete data set and can draw some slightly more firm conclusions from it. But yeah, I mean, there are still opportunities for the army out in Germany. The soldiers will still get sent out there to train, and you know they're using it as preparation for training to go to Kabrit, for example, in Estonia, and work with NATO allies. There's still an active, you know, reserve unit out there that's working with the Bundeswehr directly on amphibious bridging, which is a really key component and capability the British don't have domestically here in the UK. So professionally, the army will continue to be there, but it won't have the same. Germany won't remain the same sort of sense. There won't be a whole generation of soldiers that call Germany home in the same way as there were, you know, between 1945 and 2015.
Completely. And I suppose we've journeyed through this exhibition with these 3 tours. And I suppose just to finish off and round us up, do you have a favourite object or a favourite story from it? It's really difficult because there's so many. It's a bit like
asking you to pick your favourite child.
Well, we won't ask you that.
Yeah, no, don't ask me that either. I think my favourite object in this is really, I think it's the yellow handbag. It's the case of Herforder, because it represents a lot of things. You know, it in and of itself, the yellow handbag, it's sort of this icon of British Army culture in the Cold War. You know, people instantly know what it is. It's one of these things, if you know, and if you were there, you know, type thing. And if you don't know, you weren't there. But that in itself is quite interesting because it shows how, you know, significant this was for the army in Germany, and how it didn't just, you know, and how it took, because that's a German beer, so obviously it was taken from German culture as well. There's a cultural exchange element to that too. It shows how important the British Army was to towns like Hereford, where Herford Brauerei is located, and how significant they were to the local businesses. But also it sort of is this absolute snapshot in time. And for me, the one that we've got on display in the exhibition, I actually got that from a veteran of BAOR who I saw him post it on Facebook, and I couldn't get one. I couldn't find one anywhere because, it's paper, people throw them away, they don't survive. And I emailed him and asked him if I could have it, and he said yes. And I just gave him the money for the postage, and he sent it in. And so now it's in the exhibition, and now we've preserved it forever in the collection of the National Army Museum. So yeah, I think if I had to choose one thing, it would be the yellow handbag.
That's great. Thank you, Peter. We've got lots of people asking when they can come and see this exhibition. And of course, our doors do still remain closed in line with government guidelines and national lockdown. And we will confirm reopening dates in line with the government's roadmap as and when we can, and we will be sharing those things with you either on our website or social media. So of course, as soon as we know, and we can let you all know, and we can get you all back in and see our fantastic exhibition of Photofriend, the British Army in Germany. But do just keep checking our website for updates.
I'm delighted to say as well that whilst a lot of the stuff online says the exhibition's due to close it in May, we're actually going to extend the run. So
yeah, we'll let you know the
will be a great opportunity.
Yeah, we'll let you know the updates of when that's extending to as well. So there's going to be plenty of time for you all to come and enjoy this exhibition where we haven't been able to due to being closed. So it's just so great that we can get so many of you over to see it and see all of the hard work that's gone into it. And it's not just the exhibition. Peter has also written a book on the subject called British Forces in Germany, the lived experience. And it really does drill down into these personal experiences of this period. So if you do have the chance, do click on the green button, and we'll be able, if you're on Crowdcast, or I'm sure we'll give you the links on Facebook and YouTube to buy a copy of his book and support the work of the National Army Museum. So thank you everyone for joining us on this 3-part series of our virtual tours. We really hope that you've enjoyed them. Tomorrow we have a talk on Bricksmiths, so you can hop on over to the National Army Museum's Crowdcast and listen to that talk tomorrow with Steve Gibson. But thank you once again, Peter, for your time and your knowledge sharing. It's always great to chat to you about this. And to everyone at home, we hope to see you again soon, either virtually or in person when we're able to reunite. Take care.
Bye, everybody.